So the Star Trek game is finally released. The game, like the movie, is a fresh reboot for the series. Being a movie licensed title, I had very low expectations going in, but have been surprised in some areas and disappointed in others. This is my review for Star Trek the game. I have to say my very first impression of Star Trek was that it felt and looked very much like a Mass Effect clone. Okay, clone may be a strong word, but the game does feel inspired by the Mass Effect franchise. The game starts out by either choosing to fill the shoes of either Kirk or Spock. Regardless, the other will accompany you on missions and act as a pseudo-squad mate with really bad AI. At its core, Star Trek is a cover-based shooter with a good mix of platforming and a dash of puzzle solving and item finding. The story unfolds at a fairly fast pace, and the game makes extensive use of in-game quick cutscenes and has a heavily scripted feel. The story is fairly solid, but at times feels a bit uninspired, and while I have only seen trailers of the newest movie, it doesn't appear that it ties into the game at all. Sadly, the game suffers from several problems, which is disappointing since it has been reported that it has been finished for some time now and is only being held back because of the release of the movie. It's disappointing because many of the game's glaring issues could have been fixed and polished in that time. First, the game suffers from poor companion AI. Playing as Kirk, I would often find Spock straggling far behind me only to be teleported to my location. He's competent enough in combat, but usually died multiple times on tougher fights. Next, the models move stiffly. Kirk runs like someone crammed a phaser into his warp drive core, for example, and they can often be seen gliding across the floor or having body parts that rapidly vibrate. One big glitch I encountered in an early boss fight left the boss dead on the floor with Spock stuck in combat, and the door needed to advance still blocked off because the scripted fight end didn't happen correctly. The cover system feels sluggish and a bit sticky and not as smooth as many other games. The game also suffers at random times from a stuttering camera and choppy frame rates. Sadly, while the bugs are not game-breaking, they are frequent and noticeable, which is a true shame because the game does have some genuine sparks of creativity, and an otherwise decent game is brought down to a subpar level. For example, the game makes heavy use of the tricorder, which you will use to hack doors, consoles, and various other objects. It also adds a dash of strategy as it can be used to activate or deactivate shields that you can then use for cover. The tricorder can also be used to scan dead enemy types and weapons you haven't encountered before. This gives you experience points that you can then use to buy upgrades for your weapons in the tricorder itself. The game manages to make it feel like an important Starfleet tool that it is. The combat also varies as it is a mix of both killing and the use of your phaser stun capability. Without giving away too much of the story, I will simply say it's important not to kill certain targets. Instead, you can stun them and then take them down. Apparently, Starfleet Command frowns upon its officers mowing down red shirts. I don't know. The pacing of the game is one of its brighter points, however, and it has been designed fairly well. You get a good mix of gameplay between combat, platforming, and mild puzzle solving, and it's spread very well throughout the game. None of the sections start to feel overly repetitive for too long. The game's dialogue is voiced by the movie's cast, and while competent, isn't really one of the game's high points because the rigid models, poor camera, and character placement during conversations really distracts you. It lacks that personal conversation feeling you would get from something such as a BioWare game. It's also worth mentioning that while I tend to focus on the single-player aspects of the games, numerous customers have complained that the co-op play in the PC version simply does not work. So if you are purchasing this game for the co-op, keep an eye on the Steam forums for an update on this issue. Star Trek isn't a particularly bad game. In fact, it could have been a fairly solid one. It's always a bit sad to see a game that could have so much promise sink into mediocrity because of a simple lack of quality control testing and bug fixing. What makes the issue worse is Namco Bandai seems to be more interested in denying the game's issues altogether and padding its Metacritic score with employees instead of actually addressing these problems. I have to admit, assigning a score to the game has been a tough call for me. Despite all of the issues and the occasional frustration, I did enjoy it overall. Die-hard Star Trek fans who can or will overlook the minor bugs will most likely get a lot of enjoyment out of the game. But as it currently stands, I would have to recommend waiting for a deep Steam sale discount before picking this title up, as paying the full retail price for this one is going to leave a lot of players feeling burnt. Overall, I'm giving Star Trek a 6.5 out of 10.
Energize.